is 5 in the morning. A man is grouped together with others in one of the lines that form in the square. They all wear striped shirts and pants. In front of them, a German officer goes over a list. The snow falls and the prisoner feels very hungry. Suddenly, the soldier indicates that the review must begin again. Perhaps one of those in line will not be able to take anymore and fall to the ground, where he will remain until he dies. Meanwhile, the man sees women entering the medical barracks. Experiments are carried out there, but nobody knows what kind, only that they involve other ways of dying, different from the usual ones. It is 1945, and the place where all this happens is Auschwitz-Birkenau, one of the most remembered concentration and extermination camps of the Third Reich. Thousands and thousands were built during this time. But what was daily life like inside? Today, we're going to find out. So, make yourself comfortable and prepare to travel back in time. Nazi Germany never doubted its intentions towards the Jews. Since Adolf Hitler's rise to the role of Chancellor in 1933, there had been anti-Semitic propaganda, as well as pogroms and the progressive deportation of Jews and their families. Hitler justified this procedure for two reasons. One was related to the international Jewish financial community. According to his vision, it oppressed the German people through the forced payment of the fines for World War I. That is to say, those dictated by the Treaty of Versailles. On the other hand, there was the living space theory, which established that the descendants of the so-called Aryan race had to regain territories in Central and Eastern Europe. Therefore, concentration camps were established as early as 1933, with the renowned Dachau at the helm. But although they were the destination of the Jews, they also received homosexuals, blacks, gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, Germans of other political affiliations, and compatriots considered harmful to the national health. The systemized massacre of Jewish communities would come in 1941, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union. But how did the prisoners get to those places? The Holocaust, or Shoah, catastrophe in Hebrew, began in the trains. Old, young, men, women, and children were crammed into the wagons. The heat was stifling and the humiliation was palpable. It was the first stop in hell, and many did not survive. I felt a lot of bodies crushing me. I could barely breathe, but I could still feel my mother's hand clutching mine, says Edith Roth, a survivor. Once they arrived at the concentration camp, the Nazis confiscated their belongings, forced them to undress, and divided them into two groups. The first consisting of children, the elderly, the sick, and the disabled, who went directly to gas chambers under the promise of a restorative shower. The second group was made up of strong men and women whose destiny was slave labor, but not before being shaved and literally tattooed with a number that from that moment on would replace their names. Also, from then on, they would not have other clothing than jackets with the well-known yellow star and striped pants, or dresses in the case of women. Nor would they have more than windowless wooden and brick barracks with bunks for 5 or 6 people. Although the measurements of each camp varied, in general they coincided in several points. So what was the daily routine like in these concentration camps? To illustrate, let's take a normal day in Auschwitz as an example. The day began at 4:30 in summer and 5:30 in winter. Then there was a roll call that dragged on if the numbers didn't add up. When everything was done, an orchestra accompanied the departure of the working groups. There were 3 very meager meals a day, all of dubious composition. This improved slightly in 1942, but not for Jews or Soviets. As of March 1942, the minimum number of working hours was 11. The men worked both outside and inside the camp, and the SS escorted them back before dark, usually carrying the bodies of those who had died or been killed. Then another roll call was done, and after that, they were given some time to go to the lavatories and bathrooms. Until 9 p.m., they could receive mail or visits from inmates from other blocks. Interestingly, there was no work on Sundays or holidays. The prisoners spent those days cleaning their rooms, fixing or washing their clothes, or cutting their hair. They could also go to orchestra concerts and send letters to their families. Now we enter another area of the question. Just as they had implemented an administrative zone and barracks for the SS separate from the prisoner sector, the Nazis established a hierarchical identification system according to nationality and reasons for imprisonment. Those with higher social status were rewarded with slightly more desirable jobs, such as administrative or supervisory positions that were decisive for the life or death of other inmates. And of course, those lower down on this scale had more demanding tasks in factories, mining, and construction. But beyond any order, physical exhaustion, meager rations, and dehumanized treatment were the common currency, in such a way that the punishments were even worse than death. For example, in September 1942, the first mass extermination actions were carried out by means of Zyklon B, a pesticide that began to be used in gas chambers as it was a more efficient method of murder. Furthermore, as the military defeats took place, the greater the degree of torture and killings. In the Buchenwald camp, the Germans took away their captives' rations for 3 days in revenge for the attack on Hitler in 1939. This same camp, where many literally worked to death or died of cold and hunger, also suffered from epidemics of dysentery and typhus. The prisoners only had the choice of slave labor or execution, which could be by firearms, by hanging, or in slower, terrifying ways. For example, in Mauthausen camp, they could throw a prisoner off a cliff for not carrying a heavy enough stone. Another form of punishment was to lock the person in a cell the size of a grave and let him starve to death. In addition, there were random and arbitrary killings. It was also frequent to punish a prisoner with lashes that he had to count in German. And this daily routine also included hitting and screaming, applying ink to prisoners' eyes to give them a bluish color, timing how long it took for a person submerged in frozen water to die, and conducting medical experiments with transplants, amputations, and chemicals. Adult and children were victims alike. I did not live in Auschwitz because the place itself was death, recalls survivor Henri Kichka. We leave the rest of the brutalities to your imagination. It is enough to add that there were subordinate camps dedicated to German industry, especially the armaments industry, where forced and torturous labor continued. What the Americans and Soviets found upon discovering the camps in 1945 was devastating. Piled up corpses, skeletal bodies, and the glances of people who, as philosopher Hannah Arendt would describe, were emptied of all identity and soul. The total number of concentration camps was over 40,000, built not only in Germany, but also in Russian, Polish, French, and African lands. All contributed to the genocide of more than 6 million Jews, together with, according to the latest sources, more than 11 million people of other ethnic groups, most of them Soviet citizens and prisoners, about 9 million, and Poles, about 500,000. We are reaching the end of this episode, and it is time for us to ask you, which part of the concentration camp system did you find the most shocking? Leave us your comment below. We also invite you to subscribe and activate notifications to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history. Thank you very much for joining us, and until the next video.